There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains themes of alcohol abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, and murder. If you find these things triggering, this episode might not be right for you.
In July 2011, a man named Dennis Costas called in sick to work. He told his employer he was suffering from sciatica. For the rest of the afternoon, he drank heavily, characteristic of a man with a serious drinking problem. Speaking to Dr. Richard Taylor, he said he couldn't remember much from that day. "My recollection is very distorted," he said. He took a nap at some point, and after that, he explained, "I really don't know what happened. All I can remember is putting out the fire. My vision was blurred. I heard a voice and I came out of the flat door. I went back in again and then out to the lobby. There was a fire in the living room and I put water on it." There was a lot he couldn't remember from that afternoon and into the early hours of the next morning. At 3:50 a.m, police were called to a 4-storey low-rise apartment block in Upton Park, East London, by a resident who said they were awoken to banging on their door. When police arrived, residents were scattered across the car park. Police ran to the top storey, where they saw a person walking towards them, and they said it was like something out of a horror movie. One police officer said he had never seen anything like it before. The person had burns to their face and body, and the officer said, "For a split second, a feeling of unreality overcame me." Eventually, the person gave her name as Sophia. She had arrived home at 3 a.m, and her former boyfriend had been waiting inside. He doused her in petrol and lit a match. That man, she said, was Dennis Costas, a man who claimed he had no recollection of what had taken place. So, had Dennis been involved? And if so, why didn't he remember it? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with forensic psychiatrist Dr. Richard Taylor. His book, The Mind of a Murderer, gives insight into the darkest corners of the human psyche. And a quick note before we begin. The story of Dennis Costas is a composite of a few cases Dr. Taylor worked on. His identity is disguised with alterations made to certain details. In November 2011, you visited a man who in the book you refer to as Dennis Costas. What had he been charged with?
Well, initially it wasn't murder because the victim was still alive. So I believe it was attempted murder was the original charge. He was arrested. He was so drunk he wasn't fit for police interview. But he was at some point in the ensuing 24 hours charged with attempted murder.
So he's then arrested. When he is arrested, he says that he can't remember what he did. Is that a common defence in your experience, that people will say they have no memory of what took place?
It is, and it's pretty consistent that around 30% of people arrested on serious offences, serious violent offences, report, at least initially, amnesia. And there's 3 nice studies, one on offenders, one on prisoners. I forget the sample of the other one, but there are consistent research finding that when you analyse cases of offenders of serious violence, that they say they can't remember.
And in the case of Costas, there was some pretty compelling evidence. I believe there was CCTV. There wasn't a lot of doubt over who did it. What was his response when he was presented with all of that? Was that a bit of cognitive dissonance? Did he panic?
So he reported first total amnesia, and then he began to remember little bits. And that's consistent with, a genuine cause of memory loss, i.e. alcohol memory blackouts, which, was one of the major candidates for explaining his loss of memory. But he kept shifting his account to try and explain the evidence as it came in, to try and make it less worse, shall we say. I recall the CCTV footage. He was clearly staggering drunk to the gas station to pick up the petrol that he used to burn his girlfriend to death. Once he was confronted with that, he said, well, yeah, that probably is me, and I think maybe I was feeling suicidal. So, in other words, exculpating himself from any hostile intent to his girlfriend, trying to explain why he'd buy petrol. And then later on, very tellingly, he spontaneously said to me that he thought he tried to dial emergency services, 999 in the UK, and either that he didn't get through or they didn't answer. Of course, that's totally implausible. But in the evidence against him, there was no record of any attempt to dial emergency services. So, he's trying to explain what he's been shown by his lawyers from the prosecution case bundle.
And in terms of amnesia, if you've done something really bad, if you've killed someone, which was eventually the case with him, is it a defence in a court of law? Is that something that can either make you appear less culpable in the eyes of a judge or, be an excuse?
So obviously varies a bit in different jurisdictions around the world, but under UK law, amnesia is not a defence. And that's been established in some case law going back many years. And I think, again, as I explore, some defendants think that if they say they can't remember, that it will be an excuse. And then when it's explained to them, some of them will then recant and say, well, actually, I do remember, and I was feeling like X or Y. Because, if you're going to mount a psychiatric or medical defense, you've got to be able to say what you were thinking at the time. And they eventually realized that.
You had an example in the book of a Nazi soldier, I believe, who tried to claim amnesia, but when he realised he couldn't defend himself, said that wasn't the case.
That's right. Yeah, Rudolf Hess, who was a prisoner, he was one of the few senior Nazis who wasn't executed at Nuremberg, and he remained a prisoner for many years. A brother of a good friend of mine was in the British military involved in guarding him, pre the end of the Cold War. But yes, he said he could remember, and then exactly that, couldn't mount a defence, and so changed his mind. The major case in British case law involved somebody who claimed amnesia for a murder and then eventually admitted doing it.
So you're a forensic psychiatrist, and by the time you spoke to Dennis Costas, what was your job exactly? What was your role when you sat down with someone like him? What were you looking for exactly?
So I was working, as I still am, in clinical forensic psychiatry, which is in a secure hospital assessing and treating people with a mental disorder who've committed generally serious offences. And the other half of my job, I work with the police. But this was a independent practice, what we call medical legal practice. I was instructed by his defence lawyers, and they were saying, look, our client says that he can't remember anything, and he's going to trial, and we're struggling to make sense of this. And they gave me what we call it a psychiatric fishing expedition, because they gave me a comprehensive list of all the possibilities, including was he suffering from post-traumatic stress? Did he have a brain disease? And so it was, dear doctor, please, can you go and interview this man, read all the papers and tell us if he has a defence?
So how do you determine if someone truly has amnesia? Can you do something like on American talk shows you see lie detector tests? Can you do something like a lie detector test to tell if someone's telling the truth?
Well, there's a whole science around lie detector tests, and they obviously do have some validity, but they're not admissible in a UK court of law. And I think when you're trying to convict somebody, which has to be beyond reasonable doubt, then lie detector tests will not get over that threshold because of the difficulties with it. So, as I describe in this chapter, the only way you can deal with amnesia is to sort of run through all the various possibilities and exclude them until you're left with the one that's most likely.
So one possibility that you explore is something like a brain tumour, which can change someone's behaviour and mean that they behave in a way that's out of character. Have you ever seen anything like that before?
Yes, well, there was a case which I refer to as Mr. Rossi, and this was a man who presented with a really quite rare form of early onset dementia. And so he walked into an emergency room with quite serious injuries to his own hands, which were caused by his hand slipping down a knife. He'd killed his wife with multiple stab wounds. And he said, I cut my hand on a can of food, and then he gave a different account. And I do think in his case, the amnesia was genuine because he was in the early stages of a type of dementia that it's called frontotemporal dementia, but it goes on to a motor neuron disease picture and is ultimately fatal. I mean, he died a couple of years after the offence.
So in his case, he did have a type of almost brain damage, which meant that he couldn't remember what he did. Does that mean that he has diminished responsibility, or just that in retrospect he can't recall it?
That's a very good question, because in a sense the amnesia itself doesn't exculpate him or reduce his responsibility, but the amnesia was part of a mental disorder because he was also experiencing hallucinations. So although he turns up in the emergency room, can't remember, he's also, seeing things and hearing things. And, a junior psychiatrist interviewed him and recorded it all. So you've got a really good interview, like within 24 hours of the offence, showing that as well as amnesia, he also had a mental disorder.
And in the case, back to Dennis Costas, did he have any history of mental illness?
Again, obviously the case is constructed in some ways, but there was no history of mental disorder in that case because the issue was essentially a man doing a normal job, albeit with a complicated personal life and an alcohol problem. I mean, I guess at one level, alcohol dependency or harmful alcohol use is a mental disorder in the broadest sense, but he didn't have schizophrenia, bipolar, or any major mental illness.
And can you speak to his complicated family life and how that might have proved some sort of motive as to why he would want to hurt this girlfriend?
Yes. So again, this didn't reveal itself until late on in my examination of the case, but essentially he was leading a double life. He's not the first person in the world to be having an extramarital affair, but it had gone on a long time and his wife didn't know about it. And he was promising the girlfriend that he would leave his wife and marry her, and he never did. And of course, as sometimes happens, the girlfriend finally got fed up with this and wanted to leave him. And as you often see with men, particularly those with certain personality traits, we call them narcissistic personality traits, he was essentially not happy. Somebody who, he had been leading along decided to want to leave him. And he had a feeling of entitlement to her. And that, I think, led to the anger.
When you sat down with him, and in fact, when you sit down with any criminal who has committed such a violent act, how does that feel? Are you struck with the images of what they've done, or do you have to try and see the humanity in everyone you visit?
I mean, yes, you have to try and see the humanity, and that's something that's often happened to me. You read about a terrible crime, and then by the time you meet the person, they don't appear menacing at all. They may be tearful, they may or may not report amnesia. But it's often surprising how innocuous they seem, really, once you interview them. And the inspiration for this case, I remember I'd been kept waiting a long time in the prison, and I needed to interview him. I didn't have enough time left, and he was sitting there in a holding tank, a glass windowed room with several other prisoners in the hospital wing waiting to be interviewed. And I had a chance to observe him before the interview. And at that point I was wondering, who is this person? How could he have done that?
Yeah, you imagine these monsters, yet in real life they would look like you or I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I have obviously interviewed some perpetrators of a homicide, murderers, shall we say, who have been menacing. I'm thinking of one man who is not in the book, but he committed a really horrible double murder, murdered his girlfriend, who called him a rapist. In fact, he was a rapist, a convicted sex offender, but he didn't like being called that, so he killed his girlfriend. And then sat there with the body, not knowing what to do. And then a healthcare worker came around a few days later and he let her in and killed her as well. And when I went to interview him, he was really chilling. And I spent a long interview asking him about his background, and we got onto the offence. And he was clearly enjoying telling me in great detail. And by the end of the interview, he said, "Doc, we haven't got enough time. You'll need to come back because I need to tell you more about this." And that was really, So yes, you do meet some people who are chilling, but on the whole, I've found, I think, more come across as innocuous on meeting them.
And in the case that Costas was based on, was he showing remorse for this crime?
No, is the short answer, because he never really accepted responsibility. So you can't regret something that you say you haven't done or you can't remember doing. Although, of course, he ended up pleading guilty once, all the evidence was put to him. And in particular, my report, which was a very detailed and meticulous report, and the solicitors were very grateful for it, because it's not so much that they wanted him to have a defence. They needed to be able to show him that they'd given him every possible chance. And they would say, "Look, we've got this 30-page report and this doctor's run through all the possibilities, and I'm afraid you haven't got a defence. So it's up to you, plead and get some mitigation or go to trial." And the evidence is overwhelming.
If it was amnesia, if it happened to an ordinary person and you did something horrible but couldn't remember it, then wouldn't you be horrified and traumatised even if you had no memory of being there but you knew what you'd done?
Yes, it's possible to be confronted with the evidence of what you've done and told that the evidence is overwhelming, and yes, feel terrible regret and remorse. I mean, that might apply to somebody who was genuinely psychotic, who couldn't remember, so that can happen. And of course, it's devastating if they've killed a family member. A case springs into mind, which actually I saw around the same time. And this was a young man who'd taken a really potent hallucinogen called AMT. You swallow it as a powder, and he was in a completely psychotic state. He thought the walls were coming in on him, seeing coloured lights, and he felt his life was in danger. And he beat his pregnant girlfriend really badly, almost killed her, and she lost a baby that was close to being born. And he, first of all, couldn't remember. Then he could remember the psychotic experiences and, of course, was devastated. And interestingly, his girlfriend forgave him.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with forensic psychiatrist Dr. Richard Taylor about his book, The Mind of a Murderer. There's a line in the book about, I think it was a judge perhaps who said it to you, who had an analogy about sand and a shore and how sometimes memory can come back. Do you ever find that people who have committed a crime and say they have forgotten it, gradually they find that memory again?
Yes, so these things aren't straightforward, but the issue of the river running out to sea is islets of memory or islands of memory. So you may start off with a block amnesia, can't remember a whole block of time, and then the amnesia may recede like water going out of a river, and you get islands popping up in the water. So I say, "Oh yes, I do remember going to the pub," or "Yeah, I do remember that we started to have an argument." And then, they can't remember bits of it. Typically, someone who's claiming amnesia that's not genuine will report the on-block amnesia. "Look, I don't remember anything of last night," or, I've seen a number of offenders who've said, I don't remember anything for my whole life," or, "I don't even know how I'm here. I don't remember how I got dressed this morning." I mean, one man who was a fraudster told me that the only thing he could remember was falling off a donkey on the beach as a child. It can be quite comical.
Is it possible that in the case of Costas, that when you do something really, really bad, that the post-traumatic response is that your mind just blocks it out? Was that a possibility you explored?
Yes, so I think that's a relatively common form of amnesia. We call it a dissociative amnesia. And essentially, the mind blocks out events that are just too painful to remember, or it may be a sense of shame. And we don't fully understand this process. I mean, it depends if you believe on the unconscious mind or not, but I think it could be an unconscious repression of something that, either they just can't bear to admit to themselves, or it's just too painful and they block it out.
With Costas, he had an alcohol dependency. What was his relationship like with alcohol, and how had that affected his mind, particularly on that day?
So actually, I've said dependency. It was more a sort of binge pattern of drinking that they can overlap. But on a heavy day's drinking, he was drinking really serious amounts. We're talking 1.5 bottles of spirits, and certainly consistent with somebody who's so drunk that they're not going to remember. It's not outside the realm of normal human experience to have a really heavy night and not quite remember what you did in the bar. But in his case, this is quite a frequent occurrence.
Could that amount of drinking over, say, decades lead to periods of amnesia or some sort of degeneration of the brain?
Yes, so the long-term organic, which is the term we use in medicine for something that has a physical cause, long-term brain damage can cause various syndromes which are associated with amnesia. Most importantly is that I call it the Groundhog Day syndrome, because the real, in medicine it's called a Wernicke's encephalopathy followed by Korsakoff syndrome. And I thought, well, I'm not sure if the reader needs to know that, but you can end up with, there's an acute phase where you're in a confusional state. And at that point, you can still be rescued with intravenous vitamins, but if you don't get the right treatment, you end up with brain damage to a particular part of the memory circuits, which leaves you unable to lay down new memory. So like every day is a fresh day, and you don't remember the day before, although you'll remember your earlier biography.
Were there any signs of that for this man prior to the crime he committed? That there were memory issues, or that, his brain wasn't functioning as it should? Or did this seem like a one-off occurrence?
So this seemed like, a one-off occurrence, unless it was alcohol memory blackouts, in which case that had happened before. But, this was a man holding down a normal job, albeit struggling with really massive hangovers on some days of work. But no history of this sort of going forwards Groundhog Day type amnesia. And also the pattern of memory loss at the time of the offence. Essentially, he's arrested a few hours after, setting fire to someone, initially can't remember, sobers up, and then starts fairly quickly to remember patches of what happened. And that doesn't fit with the kind of brain syndromes that are related to alcohol. I mean, there's another one, delirium. People have heard of the DTs, shakes and withdrawal, but actually DTs in medical terms refers to an acute syndrome that's life-threatening. But again, the DTs come on as you're drying out. So the time period, would be later. He was drinking right up until the offence. And so to get the DTs, generally, you'd be looking at, a day or two after you, or a day after you've stopped drinking.
What's interesting, and it's a point that you make, that a lot of people drink, and a lot of people drink too much, and they don't commit a violent crime. But in his case, if he was that incapacitated, the crime he committed was fairly complicated in terms of him having to avoid the fire he started. How did you put that together, that he was able to do that, yet also was seriously, by any limit, like very intoxicated?
So people are capable of pretty complex, organised activities, even if the following day they don't remember it. So in a sense, they are conscious actions. It's not a complete, automatism where they're lacking awareness. So at that moment, they are likely, they know what they're doing. It's just that they don't recall it later on. And in his case, we're talking about someone who probably discovered that the person that he had been treating terribly for a long time had decided to meet someone else. And, he can't cope with that, feels a sense of entitlement. And so he walks to the gas station, buys a can of gas and stays in her flat till she comes home. So, as you say, pretty planned and purposeful activity.
There are some myths that go on about alcohol consumption and people thinking that they almost have another persona when they drink, whether that's for better or for worse. Is there an element of that that's true, and that perhaps the things even an ordinary person does or says reveals some unconscious thought?
Well, alcohol is an inhibitory drug. So it slows down the brain. And although, paradoxically, the first couple of drinks, people can be more lively, come out of themselves. But ultimately, the more you drink, it's a brain depressant. And it may act on different parts of the brain. And I mean, within the same person, people may have come across someone who sometimes when they've been drinking, they're the life and soul of the party. And sometimes they're what we call maudlin drunk. They're sitting there crying into their pipe. So, yeah, different people have different responses, but that's just the way it affects them.
So what conclusion did you ultimately come to with Costas? I mean, there's a gut feeling, but there's also all the research and science behind it. What do you think he remembered or didn't remember from that crime?
I think that when he woke up, when the police came and knocked on his door and said, "You're under arrest," I think he probably didn't remember what had happened, at least initially. But, he told me some months later that he'd recalled patches, albeit they were patches that helped him explain the evidence that was against him. And essentially his account was, look, I think I was so upset that I got the petrol to kill myself. And unfortunately, I spilled it on her instead of me. That was more or less his defense. Plus, I can't really remember. So I thought, alcohol memory blackout probably initially. He started getting patchy memory recovery, which you can see in alcohol memory blackout. And so I think it's likely he gradually remembered what had happened, but it was such an awful offence. It was easier for him to just stick that he couldn't remember, because to actually admit that he set fire to someone and killed them was just too much.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, because as you said, there are a relatively high percentage of people that say they don't remember a crime. How often do you think that's seriously true? Whether that's a result of trauma, someone willing away the memory, locking it in a box. How often do you even sit across from someone and think, okay, this person does not remember what they did?
I can't give you a percentage on that, but let's say 30% report amnesia, and a proportion of those are genuine, either from organic brain disease or alcohol memory blackout or psychosis. So plucking a figure out of the hat, maybe 10%. I can think of someone who I've treated who in a psychotic state thought his life was in danger, all this persecutory delusions, hearing voices. And he'd previously had confrontations with neighbours. On this occasion, he burst through the door swinging a meat cleaver and didn't kill the victim. Luckily, took a great big swing and just took a chunk out of the victim's scalp. But he, long time afterwards, said he couldn't remember. And I think that probably was genuine in his case. I mean, terrifying offence, because this guy was, 22 stone and in a completely psychotic state. But fortunately, the victim lived. I think he probably genuinely didn't remember that.
For almost 3 decades, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Richard Taylor has been assessing the minds of people who have committed horrendous crimes. He's worked on over 100 murder cases, as well as cases of arson and conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction. His book, The Mind of a Murderer, deep dives into the psyche of killers and explores the question, why do people kill? You can find a link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Leah Porges and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. Keep up to date with true crime as it happens with Mamma Mia's news podcast, The Quickie. On the back of the conviction over George Floyd's death, they spoke to a leading civil rights activist to find out whether this could be the beginning of the end of racism not only in America, but also here in Australia.
We here in Australia are not immune to the same systems that seem to be broken in the US. What message do you have for people here in Australia who are trying to get the same kind of momentum and movement behind the support of the lives of Black people here in this country? What message would you have for them?
I'd say don't be discouraged. Remember that we are often telling a story about a world that we've never seen, but we know it's possible, and that's actually just hard work. In 2014, we were convincing people there's a problem. In 2020, we are trying to get people to do something about it because they have acknowledged that something is wrong. But I'd say keep the fight, and we can win in this lifetime. I don't think that I'm fighting for something 300 years away. I think that we can win in this lifetime.
You'll find a link to that episode in our show notes.